As we read Genesis 1, and as we try to picture it in our heads, especially if we're trying to read it very literally, there are a number of questions that come up. There's a bunch of observations that we make, and you've noticed them, I'm sure. And as you have noticed these observations, and if you've noticed the challenges that we have in trying to picture this and make it literal, it does raise questions. And it means that no matter what view of Genesis 1 you hold, you have some explaining to do. You have to try to explain how these things fit and what these things mean. Are they figurative? Are they literal? If they're literal, how do they fit with reality? How do we deal with these sorts of things? So I would like to just walk through briefly some of the major views on Genesis 1 and explain a little bit of how they deal with some of these things. As I mentioned, there are a number of observations that we need to make that don't seem to fit with our experience. There's many more in the text that I am not pulling out. These are probably some of the most obvious ones. There are obviously other things that we could talk about. There are observations from the Hebrew text that I can't probably show you quite as easily, but are also as challenging to deal with and as interesting to think about. But here are a few of them. So for example, and these have been noticed for obviously millennia, since they were written probably, and they probably deal with some things that we're not necessarily understanding, but we'll talk about this. So light before the sun. In day 1 we have the light, but in day 4 we have the lights, the sun, moon, and stars. And yet, of course, beginning in day 1 we have morning and evening each day. So there's sort of this 24-hour cycle going on, and yet there's no sun, moon, and stars. In day 2, we have God separating the waters above the heavens from the waters below the heavens, or this space, the rakia that Hebrew talks about, and he calls it the heaven. And so you have waters above the heaven. What does that mean? You have plants in day 3, and yet the sun doesn't show up until day 4. Why? We have heavens and the earth created in verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And yet in verse 8, he creates the heavens, and in verse 10, he creates the earth. So how does this work? What's going on? We have 2 different orders of creation, which most people don't really think about a lot, possibly partly because of our translations. But in chapter 1, we have one order, but in chapter 2, if it were to be read normally, and you can see that in some of the translations like New American Standard, it doesn't say he had created the animals, but he created the animals, and that's because the Hebrew doesn't give that distinction clearly. Can you say it that way? Yes. Is it necessarily so? Well, if that's all you had, you wouldn't recognize that. So it seems as if you have to at least explain why the order is given differently. And why is it that you have things being presented in a different way? So those are some of the observations. There are other things, but all of those have suggested to various people that maybe he's not trying to give a 24-hour literal accounting of how God created. And so that's what I would like to at least walk through in terms of the various observations that people make and the various views that they have because of those. Probably at least the most common view that many people hold, and in fact some people would suggest that if you don't hold this view, you must not believe the Bible. Many would disagree with that, myself included, but we will talk about that in just a moment. So the 24-hour day, represented by Answers in Genesis or Creation Research Institute or others as well, basically is stating that creation is accomplished by God in 6 consecutive calendar days with 1 calendar day of rest following. So it's a fairly straightforward understanding of the text, seeing it in a very clear, at least from our 21st century perspective. Support for the view includes that the way day is usually used in the Old Testament would suggest what we consider a 24-hour day. So that's our basic impression. You see the numbered evening and morning formulas, 1 day, a 2nd day, a 3rd day, a 4th day, etc. And that would suggest a regular week. You also see Exodus 20:9 to 11, in which Moses uses it to command the Sabbath observance, and just like God worked and rested in 7 days, so you should work and rest in the 7th day. So that makes sense to see it that way. And then of course in the New Testament, perspectives seem to fit there as well, but that's probably not direct support, but indirect support. A second view, which we often call the day-age view, began really with many of the ancients as well. So you have ancients such as Josephus or Irenaeus or Origen, Modern people would include Hodges and Warfield, or Laird Harris, or Hugh Ross, or in Reasons to Believe. So there's a number of folks that hold the day-age view. The definition of this is creation is accomplished by God in 6 successive indefinite periods of time that may overlap and be presented from the point of view of the earth, so which means the sun would appear on day 4 but may have been created actually on day 1. This was held by ancients regardless of science, so that's an interesting perspective, but it is still a very common view with a lot of people. Support for the day-age view begins with day 7, noticing that in day 7 there's no concluding formula. There was evening, there was morning, the 7th day. So while it talks about the 7th day, it doesn't ever seem to stop. And in fact, Hebrews 4 seems to support that as well, where it talks about the unending rest of God that we can enjoy and join in. A second point is that day 6 is seems like there's an awful lot of stuff that happens in it, especially if we put chapter 2 into day 6, and you almost have to, because you've got the creation of both Adam and Eve in chapter 2. So you have the creation of the animals, you have the creation of Adam, then you have the putting of Adam in the garden and instructing him, and then you have him having to name all the animals and realizing that, whoa, wait a minute, I'm alone, I need somebody, and God creates woman. And so you have this quite a number of things that are put into this 12-hour period, really, of daylight time. Yom, the Hebrew word for day, doesn't always mean 24-hour periods, and so we have it meaning things like long periods of time. The day of the Lord is not a 24-hour period. So even here in chapter 2, verse 4, in the day that it was created, doesn't seem to be a 24-hour period. So the possibility of the meaning of the word itself, and then of course it would accord better with science, and so many would suggest that this is the better way to go because of the support of science. But as noted, some of the ancients didn't have a science to deal with, and yet they suggested this sort of an interpretation. So that would be the support. Another view is the framework view, which is actually quite similar, but it would be held by people like Meredith Kline or Mark Furtado or Derek Kidner or Bruce Waltke. And actually quite a few people would hold the framework view. Definition of the framework view is the creation week, in quotes, is understood metaphorically, in which God's creative acts are historical, but the timing and order is not stated. So it's figurative, it's literary, it's not even intending to present a chronological account, but it's intending to present a figurative and literary account. Support for the framework view would come from the patterning of the Hebrew account, because there are so many repeated words and phrases in groups of 3 or 7 or 10. There is a very strong patterning of the days themselves, and it's a normal way of figurative writing. It's unusual for Hebrew narrative, and very few scholars see Genesis 1 as normal Hebrew narrative. They would try to find another term for it because it just doesn't fit normal Hebrew narrative, but it doesn't really fit poetry either. God is never spoken of in the third person, but he's always specified 31 times here. There's just a number of things. Patterning of the creation days. You've got 2 groups of 3 days. So you've got the first 3 days and the second 3 days, and then you've got the final day. And of course the two groups of 3 days overlap. So day 1 you have light and dark, and day 5 you have sun, moon, and stars. Day 2, separation of the waters above from the waters below. And day 5 you have the filling of the heavens and the waters, and day 6 you have the separation of the land. I'm sorry, day 3 you have the separations of the land and the plants, and then in day 6 you have the animals and man. So it seems as if it's a very strong patterning of 2 groups of 3. You've got the unusual lack of the article, because it's not a normal way of saying first day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day. Instead it's one day and then a second day and a third day and a fourth day. So the Hebrew is very unusual. There's just a lot of things. Chapter 2 seems to have a different order, which I noted, and you have the difficulty of putting those two together. It's difficult to try to understand how Genesis 1 fits with chapter 2 verses 5 and 6, and there was no rain and there was no man, and yet all the plants are created. So all these sorts of things seem to fit together for a lot of people to suggest that this is really a literary framework. The Analogical Days view suggests a very similar account. This one is held by Shedd and Delitzsch and Jack Collins. It's defined as the days in the creative week are intended to represent a pattern for man to imitate and work and rest, but they're figurative. So it's similar in what we just saw, and it uses many of the same supports, but it is representing a broadly consecutive periods of God's creating through history. It doesn't specify either the length of time or necessarily chronology, but the whole point here is, while it is literary, yes, but it is specifically focused on the patterning so that man knows how to imitate God. Again, the support, very similar to the framework view. You have the same source of observations, but it really emphasizes, this view emphasizes the analogy and centrality of the Sabbath command in Exodus 20 and Exodus 31, particularly Exodus 20 because the command is comparing man's work with God's work. And you also have the repeated evening and morning refrain, which is unusual. It doesn't say there was morning and evening. First day it says there was evening and morning. So it's as if God goes to work and then he goes to rest, and he goes to work and he goes to rest, just like a person would do. And that's the suggestion, at least. The fifth view would be the cosmic temple view. In Genesis 1, you have a lot of relationships between the verbiage and the imagery of Genesis 1 and the ancient world. And so John Walton, who is the one who has promoted this, suggests that the Genesis account presents the establishing of the functions of the universe as God's cosmic temple, but not the creation of the universe. So this is functional creation, not substantive creation. So the significance here is that God is inaugurating or getting ready to function his world, and the world is indeed the temple of God. So as we'll see, that comes out of Scripture as well as the ancient world. So the support for the cosmic temple. The Bible, Old Testament, clearly presents creation as his temple. So Isaiah 66:1, we see clearly that creation is God's temple, all of creation. Genesis 1 does present some functions, and sometimes we do see that it is not necessarily new material. So he's separating the waters from the waters, for example. And is he just creating space, or is he actually creating new stuff? Ancient cosmologies present functional accounts as well in John's view and Walton's view. So what he seems to be suggesting, or what he is suggesting, is that there's not really a creation of all things out of nothing here, but there's or the creation of the material of the universe, but it's the creation of the function of the universe. The final view I'd like to consider is actually my view. It's in my book, In the Beginning We Misunderstood, and I call it the ancient instructional view. In this view, Genesis 1 is God taking Israel's perceptions of the world, the way they have viewed the world, understood the world, talked about the world, along with what is common to them, symbolism, in their context, in order to correct their erroneous theology. Support for this view comes really from all of the ancient world as well. So as you compare the account that we have in Genesis 1 with the accounts that we have in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, we find a lot of similarities in terms of the events, the order of events. They have the same logical observational problems. So you have light before the sun, but in their world, light existed apart from the sun. That's the way they perceived things. And the way they looked at the world, they looked up and they saw waters up there because it was blue, apparently. And it's consistent across the ancient world that there were cosmic waters up above the sky. So that's exactly what we see in the creation account. What he does, what God seems to be doing here, is he uses very similar language to describe the events and the way it works. What it is that he is doing here is taking their perspective, and he is using their language, and he is saying, I created all of this. And the imagery as well, it's not just particular things, but the imagery as a whole, a man coming from dust, there's just a lot of stuff. But it is giving them something very different. So what he does, if Israel is reading this, they probably would have said, oh yeah, that's what I understand. Yeah, I understand that, I see that. That makes a lot of sense. Excuse me. So what Israel would have heard and what God is communicating to them, he's communicating to them in their language, and what we need to understand is how it would have been communicated to the original audience. So that's what we really need to hear, not read it from our perspective. That doesn't mean it's wrong, it just means he chooses not to correct certain things. I'll broach that in just a moment. These are very different, however, in many ways, and we really have to recognize the differences because this is the point of what's going on here. I believe God is using this polemically. He's using it to challenge their worldview, to challenge the theology that they understood from Egypt or from the world around them and what they will see consistently throughout Canaan and Mesopotamia. And what we see in Genesis is so different because it presents God independent of creation, not created or self-created, and all the gods of the ancient world were either created or self-created. I know it's hard to understand, but that's what they believed. In the ancient world, the gods are part of creation, but in Genesis 1, of course, God alone transcends creation. He's not part of creation at all. In fact, he is sovereign over all of creation because he created it, whereas the gods of the ancient world only have their little realm in which they rule. They're not sovereign over everything. None of them are. God alone is deity instead of many deities, and all of those deities actually being parts of creation. God is alone, he's a part, he is not created, he transcends, and he is sole deity. Mankind has great significance and value as God's image, and we see that because in the ancient world, the kings were the images of God. Sometimes the priests were God's image, but only in one possible way. In the one account that we know from Egypt is all of humanity God's images, and there it's still to serve the god as his cattle. So it's a very different perspective on the humanity, the purpose of humanity, the significance of humanity, the value of humanity. In the Bible, God provides for mankind, but man does not provide for God. Whereas in the ancient world, the humans, the people, were created to provide for the gods and to relieve them of their work because they were tired of working, and man could do it for them and take care of their needs. Very different in the Bible. Israel in Genesis 1 needs to celebrate the rule of God in their lives by imitating their Creator in work and rest each week. And that celebration, of course, comes out in the Decalogue, but the creation account provides the foundation for how they can see their response to God and how they can be part of his kingdom and enjoy his work on their behalf. It's very, very different. And so what I'm suggesting is God is using their language. He's teaching them in the words that they understand, not trying to teach them things they could never get, such as astrophysics or quantum mechanics, but instead he's teaching them things that they can understand so that they can understand things that they could otherwise have no idea about, and that is who God is. He is trying to change their worldview, their understanding of who God is, how he relates to creation, how they relate to him, who they are, how they need to worship, and what their purpose and hope is. So what's the point? Well, God used their language without correcting or confusing them. I have a little diagram here that attempts to try to crystallize the biblical world perspective and how it just sees the functioning of the universe, because in the descriptions in the Bible, while they may not believe this literally, they describe it in perhaps figurative terms, where you have the foundations of the mountains, the roots of the mountains, or the pillars of the earth. You have the mountains holding up this dome that holds back this water. You've got the canopy in which the sun, moon, and stars seem to run. It's very similar to the rest of the ancient world. You have these waters outside of this bubble of light and order, if you will, which is what Egyptians thought, and you see it consistently in their writings. It's what the Mesopotamians thought. We see it consistently in their writing, and we see it in the imagery that is used in the Bible, even though we understand it figuratively, and they may well have understood it figuratively often as well. But that's the words that they use. It is what they said. It's very similar, if you will. It's very similar to what Jesus says when he says that the Father makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good. We know that the sun doesn't rise. Jesus knew that the sun doesn't rise. The people listening to Jesus probably didn't know that the sun doesn't rise. They probably didn't see the world as spinning on its axis in empty space. While there was something of that out there in Greek thought, we really didn't have Copernicus yet or Galileo, so understanding what was going on here was not yet part of the human experience. And yet Jesus doesn't correct it. He doesn't say, well, you guys need to understand that really the earth is spinning. It's not the sun rising. It's the sun appearing over the horizon because the earth is changing its position. And he didn't say that. So he doesn't correct it, but he does teach them good theology. What I need to also say is that all of these 6 views recognize the working of God and that the Bible is inerrant and authoritative. So while not everybody agrees in any of the views on all of their theology, there are people in each view that hold to the authoritative inerrancy of Scripture. There are also people in each view that hold to the historical and true nature and accounting of Genesis 1 to 3. There are people in each view that believe God created all things out of nothing. There are people in each view that see Adam and Eve as historical. There are people in each view that see the fall, the original sin, as a historical event, bringing all humanity and creation into the current state of sin, pain, and frustration. None of these views require evolution or even a theistic sort of evolution. Now, you may find people who would deny any of these things in those views, but that's not to say the view itself requires it. And I just want you to recognize that, because when we're talking about understanding these particular perspectives on Genesis 1, we're not throwing out any of these things. And I realize people claim that, but if you look at the scholars and at their beliefs, it's not true, because the issue is not the authoritative work of God in revealing Scripture, but the issue is, what did God intend Israel to understand, and what should we hear as we read Genesis 1 from an ancient perspective, understanding their context?